you've finally arrived. It has been some time since anyone has come to visit me here on my ship. You came to see if the stories are true. Tell me, which ones have you heard? Yes, that one is very true. I was declared a heretic and traitor by one of the Puritans. Well, he's gone, I'm still here. So you can guess how that went. And another, more enlightened, you might say, individual saw my value and brought me into service. You were surprised by that? No, this is not a mask. This is indeed my face. And these scars are real. My constant reminder of that day. But you're not here to listen to me go on about my past. After all, this ship is meant to gather knowledge and history of the galaxy. You are wondering why I call it Wolf's Corner. Well, it is my own corner of the galaxy, and my face is not exactly what you would call normal. Now, enough about myself. We are here to examine the history of the Imperium, and what better place to start than a world whose name is the same as the events that have crashed into it. Armageddon. A name that fits the world. A place that has faced down more horrors than most people can dream up in their worst nightmares. Oh, you think I'm just talking about the 2 invasions of this world by the Greenskins under their warlord Gazgul? My, you are rather naive, aren't you? There is far more history here than most realized. And in order to understand it, we have to go back to the very beginning of this planet. You see, Armageddon was not always known as that. Oh, you did not know that? Well, that makes sense, considering I learned this from an adept of the Mechanicus. Have you ever heard of Ulanor? Yes, the triumph of Ulanor, where the Emperor and his forces annihilated one of the greatest orc infestations the galaxy has ever seen. Sadly, this did not result in the Greenskins being cleansed from existence, as so many might have hoped. After all, there was the War of the Beast, the next great orc infestation our Imperium endured. All that came to a head on none other than Ulanor. Ironic, I know. But the orcs knew the significance of that world as well. How, I don't know, but that is the concern of other Ordos. What matters to us is the fact that when the beast and his ilk were wiped out, the Adeptus Mechanicus had been instructed to destroy Ulanor, to erase it from history. Unfortunately, they had discovered the world contained a considerable amount of ancient technology. And if you've ever met a servant of the Omnissiah, you know what happened next. Somehow, they managed to reverse engineer the orcs' teleportation technology and sent the entire planet to the edge of the Segmentum Solar. Once the planet was in place, the Fabricator General informed the High Lords that the Mechanicus had sent Ulanor into the nearest star, destroying it completely. And conveniently, there was a new world discovered in a strategic location in Segmentum Solar, ready for colonization, after the Mechanicus ensured the planet was properly examined. You figured it out. Yes, Ulanor is Armageddon. Of course, the Mechanicus will be dealt with in time, but let's keep our focus on the world below us and the various wars that have come to its people. Now, to understand the very first war, we will have to look at events that happened even further back than the War of the Beast. What do events that far back have to do with the Greenskins? Oh, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a far worse invasion. One that came to affect worlds far from this system, and whose repercussions have continued to this day. And to understand what happened, we have to look through here. The list of the greatest traitors to the Emperor, his own sons. Ah, here we are. Angron, Primarch of the 12th Legion, the World Eaters. Hold your tongue, I will explain. In my studies, I learned about what happened to the traitors after they failed to defeat the Imperium. For the World Eaters, they fled to the Eye of Terror, like the cowards they are. Once there, they found themselves fighting other traitors for what little scraps of plunder they had managed to keep during their flight. In particular, they ended up fighting against the Emperor's children, as those degenerates had begun to steal captives from the World Eaters, as well as other traitors to feed their perverse and depraved desires. This conflict came to a head on a world known as Skalathrax. There, the World Eaters and Emperor's children fought with the intent of massacring each other. That is until the night began to fall. This was a world so cold, even an Astartes in full power armor would not be able to survive. Thus, both legions pulled back into shelters to wait out the night. All except for one. A champion of the Legion, Karn, was furious that the bloodshed had stopped, and thus assaulted his own brothers with a flamer and his chain axe. From my source, this berserker cut his way through the World Eaters and the Emperor's children, butchering any and all he came across, shattering his entire legion. Let that sink in. This single berserker broke the unity of an entire Astartes legion. Granted, it was the World Eaters, who I have learned after falling, they descended into a blood-maddened craze, only caring about slaughter and murder, which we still see to this day. As a result of Karn's actions, he has earned the name the Betrayer from fellow traitors. Ironic, I know. But more importantly, he destroyed his legion, breaking them into individual warbands that now plague the Imperium at the beck and call of their own warlords. I can only imagine Angron's face when he realized how much of a fool he was for choosing the side he had. What does this have to do with Armageddon, you ask? You see, Angron did not wish to let his legion simply descend into pure anarchy and bloodshed. Or at least, not without him in command. He wanted to restore his legion into a viable force, capable of cutting its way deep into the heart of the Imperium, slaughtering countless worlds in the name of their bloody god. He spent nearly 10,000 years working to rebuild his forces. Once again, I am reminded that of all the Emperor's sons, Angron remains the most disappointing. And to emphasize that point, Angron did not restore the Legion himself. He had received help from the Chaos Gods. A space hulk known as the Devourer of Stars appeared above the demon world Angron had been left to rot on since the Horus Heresy. The giant monstrosity gave Angron an opportunity to gather together whatever forces he could get his hands on. From the reports I have gathered together, I can safely state that Angron had several million Chaos cultists, demons, and various mutants, alongside approximately 5,000 World Eaters. Those World Eaters were composed of the following warbands: Angron's Chosen, the Forsworn, Lord Skalchik's Elite, the Skull Takers of Hans Corin, the Blades of Rage, and the Wrath. As you can imagine, the fact the World Eaters were made up of various warbands meant they were only nominally under Angron's control. As long as he led them to bloodshed and slaughter, I am certain they would have followed him. Of course, Angron had no control over the Space Hulk's destination. It was literally thrown into the warp and would end up wherever the tides of the Imperium threw it out. I am certain while it was in the warp, many of those within turned on each other, maddened by the warp and driven to shed any blood they could. While the Devourer of Stars flew through the warp, the people of Armageddon had no idea what was coming towards them. You see, this was in the year 444 M41, and at the time, the world was engulfed by a warp storm. Not like the Eye of Terror. I'm certain you've gone through a system that has been surrounded by a warp storm, and only really affected the trade routes in and out of the system. That was the sort of warp storm Armageddon was dealing with at the time. For them, the issue was food limits due to the trade restrictions the storm brought. The world was dealing with food rationing when a riot broke out. With the benefit of hindsight, I can say that riot was intentionally started by Chaos cultists, who are unfortunately found in nearly every world of the Imperium. They saw an opportunity and launched an attack against the Arbites, who had tried to suppress this riot. That signaled a full-scale planetary revolt across all the hives on Armageddon. This revolt tore the world's population apart as the riots spread and grew with each passing day. On Armageddon Prime, the fact the hives were spread out across a fairly large area meant that the Arbites, PDF, and Steel Legion regiments had a very difficult time trying to put the riots down, and in fact, they grew to the point that the Loyalists were pushed back through the hives. This was not the case on Armageddon Secundus. There the hives were far closer together. While the High Command of Armageddon were paralyzed by the sudden riots across the planet, lower commanders quickly reacted and organized their own forces. As I mentioned, Secundus had the advantage of closer hives than Prime, so each time the local forces were able to suppress, or in some cases, completely eradicate the riots and cultists in their area, they could quickly redeploy and aid other areas on Secundus with their riots. As a result, the Loyalists on Secundus were able to destroy the riots during a period of roughly 6 solar months. Of course, this was done entirely by local forces. After all, the Administratum thought this was nothing more than a regularly local uprising that often happened on hive worlds across the Imperium. They had no idea this could have been anything more. At least until the Devourer of Stars was literally spat out above Armageddon. As soon as the Space Hulk re-entered real space, the Chaos Forces immediately began to attack the hives on Prime. Because the Defenders were still dealing with the riots, they had no time to organize an effective defense. In relative short order, the Prime hives were overrun by the Chaos Forces and their cultist allies, with those few Imperial forces who were able to escape the hives retreating across the equatorial jungle to Secundus. The commanders expected the Chaos Forces to be right on their heels into Secundus, but surprisingly enough, by the time they reached Secundus, they realized that the Chaos Forces were still on Prime. At the time, they had no idea what was going on there, but I'm certain they knew it was likely not something good. Fortunately, they had made a very wise decision before retreating. Using the information that Prime is heavily industrialized, and thus has large numbers of buildings and manufacturing areas, the Imperial commanders had left behind multiple infiltration teams on Prime when they retreated. These infiltration specialists kept on the move, hiding amongst the manufacturing zones, ash wastes, and even within the hive cities, avoiding contact with the traders if at all possible. The key to each of these teams was the single astropath each one of them had in their care. These Psykers had orders that the moment they felt the warp storm abating around the planet, they would try and transmit a warning to the wider Imperium. The reason being that the Imperial commanders determined the Chaos Forces would focus all their jamming equipment on Secundus, figuring there was no way the Imperium could communicate from Prime. And thankfully for the people of Armageddon, this was the right assumption. As soon as the warp storm began abating, the astropaths began transmitting their powers out into the wider Imperium. By the time the Chaos Forces realized the astropaths were on Prime, it was too late. Enraged they had missed them, hunters began to search for the infiltration teams and their astropaths, no doubt seeking to sacrifice them on the altars to Khorne in retaliation for their curse of being psychers and loyalists. While avoiding the Chaos Hunters, the infiltration teams discovered the horrifying reason why they had not pushed through the jungle and attacked Secundus. Giant Chaos temples had been built across Prime with the bones of countless innocent Imperial citizens. Just as we need air to survive, Chaos demons need warp energy to stay within our universe. Yes, if you cut off this source, then a demonic incursion on a world will disappear very quickly. And Angron was painfully aware of that fact, given that he himself was and is a demon prince. So he also requires that energy. And with the warp storm disappearing, they needed some new source. Thus, Angron intended to build these giant temples and sacrifice uncountable victims as a way of opening new warp portals to keep feeding his current demon forces and summon new allies to the slaughter. The infiltrators also transmitted this information to both the forces on Secundus and the wider Imperium. Sadly, these noble soldiers did not survive, each team being hunted down and likely butchered by Chaos Hunters in what I imagine would be the most visceral manner those blood-crazed murderers could come up with. Fortunately, the time the Chaos forces wasted hunting these infiltrators and building the temples gave the Imperium and Armageddon loyalists time to repair. Though the wider Imperium would need years to organize an effective response to this sudden assault deep within their borders, which the defenders on Armageddon did not have. However, someone else received the message from the astropaths, and they were able to respond far quicker than the wider Imperium. Like a cold wind from the mountain, they rushed to Armageddon, intending to meet Angron and his forces before all his plans could come to fruition. On the edge of the equatorial jungles, Chaos cultists waiting, with a great deal of frustration, I'm sure, for word from their masters to charge into the jungle and continue the slaughter on Secundus, heard the rumble of engines coming from the green. Likely they believed this was a desperate last charge by the Steel Legion forces that they believed were the remnants on Secundus. Expecting to simply mop up a few refugees, the cultists began to charge into the jungle. Instead of disheveled and exhausted Steel Legion and PDF troops, the cultists crashed directly into the gray-blue armored forms of the Emperor's executioners. The Space Wolves had come to Armageddon's aid, and their armored column smashed through the Chaos Horde, butchering any and all traitors that got within reach of their axes, chainswords, wolf claws, and firearms. These wolves were led by none other than the legendary Logan Grimnar, leader of his chapter. Under the eyes of their Jarl, the Sons of Fenris massacred entire armies of Chaos cultists, demons, and the handful of World Eaters spread throughout their formations until a signal was given, at which point the entire column turned around and retreated back the way they came. But they did not get very far before the cultists surged after them. Streaming into the jungle along a pre-planned route, the Space Wolves kept in contact with the Chaos forces right on their heels, continuously launching ambushes and traps to keep the traitors following them. Packs of blood claws would leap out of the brush along the path, slaughter as many of the Chaos forces as they could in a short period of time, before pulling back under the withering fire of long fangs, set up on elevated positions, pouring down a merciless stream of fire on the Horde. Together with Grey Hunters and Wolf Scouts attacking the flanks, the Chaos Horde was funneled along the route the Space Wolves had prepared, keeping them distracted and preventing them from realizing they were following the Loyalists along the path they wanted. Eventually, the Chaos Horde burst out of the equatorial jungle along the Charon River, right into the kill zone of a massive force of Steel Legion troops. Lehman Russ battle tanks, chimeras, hellhounds, basilisks, bombards, earth shard mortars all unleashed a torrent of fire straight at the cultists alongside the heavy weapons teams of the Steel Legion and the wall of lasfire from thousands of las rifles opening up. In front of the Steel Legion lines, a string of space wolves waited in the waters of the river itself, ready to cut down any chaos forces that managed to get through the wall of fire to them. From statements I have collected from wolves who were there, they did not view this fight in the river as killing enemies worthy of their blades. It was simply a butchery of animals coming to the slaughter. While warriors of the Space Wolves slaughtered cultists, demons, and world eaters that managed to get down to them, other members of their chapter fought on the bridges made from the bodies of those they had killed over the river. Leading as any Jarl should from the front, Logan Grimnar and his elite wolf guard stood on one such bridge, cutting down any forces that tried to cross in front of him. His legend was further increased when the Chaos Champion, Akor Doomflayer, pushed through the surging hordes onto the bridge. Carrying a rune-encrusted axe, this champion managed to cut down 2 of Logan's wolf guard in a matter of moments before turning his attention on the Great Wolf, who was, surprisingly enough, forced to fight for his life against the traitor. During the fight, Akor managed to strike the flat of the frost blade Logan carried, shattering the ancient weapon into thousands of shards. But Doomflayer did not have time to gloat as Logan leapt forward, ripped off the traitor's helmet with one hand, and dug his fangs deep into his throat. With a resounding rip, Logan tore Akor's entire throat down to his spine off, spitting the bloody chunk of flesh out just as the former champion fell into the churning river below. Before the body fell completely over, Logan pulled the axe free of his loose grip and proceeded to turn the weapon on the remaining traitors who had just witnessed the Great Wolf kill one of their champions. Now, while this slaughter was occurring, further to the north, Angron and his chosen, which included 12 of the most powerful bloodthirsters of Khorne, broke through the Imperial lines and surged forward towards the hives of Infernus and Hell's Reach. No doubt Angron was hoping to reach the 2 hive cities in order to continue the slaughter and hunker himself down to try and regain the initiative that clearly he had lost when the Space Wolves had arrived. It was likely he intended to open more warp portals in order to summon more demons to replace the countless numbers he had lost to the blades and bolters of the Wolves and Steel Legion on the river. But Logan Grimnar was not going to let him have that chance. Gathering what Wolves and Steel Legionnaires he could, Logan raced off to face Angron. Of course he did not intend to do so alone. Unleashing a roar that cut through all other sounds on the battlefield, Logan called upon the secret weapon he had been holding back for this very moment. Just before the Space Wolves crashed into Angron's force, 109 Grey Knights teleported into the middle of Angron's chosen and attacked. These Psyker Astartes caught Angron's force completely off guard as they focused on the Bloodthirsters and Angron himself, while the Wolves and Legionnaires cut down the rest of Angron's chosen. In one case, a Grey Knight squad under the command of Terramar Aurelian faced off against Angron. Sadly, even though the Grey Knights are powerful warriors, Angron was not known as the Red Angel for nothing. Slaughtering through the squad, Angron quickly stood before the very last standing member of it, Pyrokine Hyperion. Standing between the Demon Prince and a still alive squadmate, Hyperion used every single ounce of psychic power he possessed and hurled it at Angron. The force struck the Black Blade, the demon sword Angron had been given by Khorne himself. And shockingly enough, this shattered the sword. But it did knock Hyperion out from sheer exhaustion. The shock of this action distracted Angron long enough for Aurelian to banish Angron back into the warp at the cost of his own life. I can only imagine the roar of pure fury and anger Angron unleashed at being banished back into the warp and failing once again at achieving anything of significance. With Angron banished and the greatest of their number destroyed, the Chaos forces on Armageddon broke and fled, just as the Imperials counterattacked all across their lines. Only the few surviving World Eaters managed to flee back up to the Space Hulk, while their cultist followers and traitor guardsmen were hunted down and butchered by the vengeful Loyalists. Armageddon was secure, and once more back in the Imperial hands. But there were no feasts or songs after that victory. For you see, the war for Armageddon's soul was not over after the destruction of the World Eaters. Among the Inquisition forces were 2 Inquisitors, Emil Darkhammer and Jesmai Casnaros, whose names deserve nothing but scorn, regardless of their work for the Inquisition. You see, when the Inquisition arrived in the Armageddon system, the Great Wolf met with them to discuss the actions that would be taken after the traitors were defeated. Logan was no fool. He knew the Inquisition would suppress the facts about the war with the wider Imperium. But most of my fellows believe the old adage, that dead men tell no tales. Logan, however, does not. He demanded that the Inquisition did not carry out their usual actions, which often involved wiping out the entirety of Imperial populations on the chance they might be affected by the chaotic energies. The Great Wolf regarded the Inquisitors as little more than spoiled children, intending to break their toys to prevent them from being played with by anyone else. This action was not due to Logan's inexperience as a Great Wolf, or simply as an excuse to fight the Inquisition, though from what I've seen of the Sons of Fenris, that would not be out of character for their Jarl. Rare for an Astartes, Logan truly cares about the common people of the Imperium, even to this day. He felt that fighting to save the planet and then wiping out the entire population was a waste of loyal Imperial citizens who could better serve the Emperor fighting against the true enemies of humanity. He even structured his plans for defending the world to ensure that the civilian population would be kept as far away from the fighting as possible, thereby keeping them from learning the truth about the sort of enemy that had invaded their world. This did mean that his warriors and the Steel Legion would have to fight on ground that was far from ideal, even with the well-planned ambush they sprung, instead of the great hive cities that were, and are, such formidable defensive structures. As a result, the casualties among the Loyalists were much higher. But Logan felt the cost was better than putting the civilian population at risk to chaos corruption. Sadly, the Inquisition was not moved from their position, no matter what they do. Regardless of how insane or wasteful it appears to an outsider, they believe that it is in the right because they have done it. The 2 Inquisitors, Darkhammer and Casnaros, briefly considered launching Exterminatus on Armageddon to contain the threat of the Chaos Taint. But even they were not that stupid. Armageddon was and is too valuable to the Imperium as an industrial hub. So instead, they decided that the entire population of Armageddon, as well as the Steel Legionnaires and PDF troops who had just fought so valiantly and with such zeal against the forces of chaos, would be eradicated. This included 1 million guardsmen who had arrived from off-world after Angron had been banished to help in the mopping up operations, hunting down the last of the Chaos Forces planet-side. Inquisition stormtroopers emptied the hive cities and moved the entire populations to camps, where they sterilized them by injections in order to prevent any Chaos Taint from passing on to their children. The guardsmen were ordered into their own barracks to wait for processing. Logan and the Wolves were furious about this, but on the planet there was not much they could do. They might have been several hundred strong, but they were outnumbered by more than 100,000 stormtroopers who were carrying out this genocide. But the Inquisitors forgot one key point. In space, the Wolves had 16 ships to their 12, and their ships were much bigger. While the stormtroopers tried to herd all the Armageddon population into nice, neat areas to wipe them out, even that many stormtroopers cannot empty all the hive cities of Secundus as well as all the guardsmen on planet. As a result, 20 transports which had been assigned to transport the troops off-world to other war zones, as soon as the fighting was complete, were loaded with soldiers and civilians under protection from the Space Wolves and without the Inquisition's knowledge. The first transport to leave for the warp jump point on the edge of the Armageddon system was loaded with 400,000 troops and civilians, guarded by the frigate Runefire. Sadly, the transport was disabled by a Grey Knight frigate and then destroyed with all hands. The Space Wolf ship did not fire on the Grey Knights because Logan had thought even the Inquisition would not fire on a transport guarded by one of his ships. After that tragedy, Logan ordered every other transport that was loaded to make for the warp jump point together, and he instructed his ships to put themselves between the transports and any Inquisition vessels that may try and attack. Cisneros tried to reason with the Great Wolf, but eventually descended into threats and insults against Logan, who simply laughed at the Lord Inquisitor's hubris. Thinking he could cow Logan, Cisneros ordered his ships to fire on the Space Wolves as well as the transports. At that moment, Logan once more played his ace. Several Space Wolf warships appeared in the Armageddon system directly behind the Inquisition's fleet, leaving them trapped between two packs of angry wolves. I imagine the Great Wolf was smiling quite happily when he told the Inquisitor that he could either call off his hounds or learn what it meant to cross a wolf pack. Thanks to the Space Wolves' protection, the transports made it into the warp and away from the Inquisition. The survivors were escorted far away from their home system and hidden amongst the other planetary populations and war zones by the wolves, where even the Inquisition could not find them. Unfortunately, this gallant action by the Sons of Rus had consequences for other innocents. Any system, planet, station, or even ship that happened to come into contact with the transports the wolves escorted became a target for the Inquisition's purges. Cisneros chased the wolves and their charges across several sectors, his ships destroying several planets and space stations. This happened even if the ship simply docked at a station and received some supplies, the people inside never even stepping onto the station. During this hunt, the Grey Knights brought larger forces to the Inquisitor's aid, even some survivors from Armageddon itself. Grandmaster Joros himself commanded these forces and became an advisor to Cisneros. During this chase, the Inquisition hunted the wolves and those under their protection, but they were never able to get the wolves to attack back, even when they would open fire on their ships. This began to cause frustration and concern among the Grey Knights, and even some of the Inquisitors who had agreed with the purges at the start of the war. Of course, the Inquisitors who had disagreed with the purges were among the most vocal against this action. They saw it as one man's petty obsession to get revenge against a chapter of clearly loyal Astartes, simply because they had snubbed his authority. Amongst these were the Inquisitor Annika Jarlsdottir. She, alongside some of the Grey Knights, gave a name to this time of the campaign, the Months of Shame. Fitting, if you ask me. The wolves stayed true to their beliefs and had never turned their guns on loyal subjects of the Imperium, while the Inquisition were charging around the galaxy, chasing their own tail, burning anything and everything in their path on the off chance they might prevent a spread of chaos. Ironic that they were causing more damage to the Imperium than a chaos incursion could. After 5 months of Logan and the Space Wolves making fools out of them, Joros suggested that the Inquisition needed to capture the Great Wolf himself. I could tell you that trying to cage a wolf like him is a feat left to madmen and fools, but I think you can already imagine which one Joros and Cisneros were. The Inquisitor agreed to this plan and sent a message to Logan. On the outside, it was an offer to speak to each other to try and bring an end to this bloody mess. But I'm sure the Great Wolf knew what the real purpose of this was. Of course, any chance to stop the bloodshed was better than letting it continue, so Logan agreed to meet with the Inquisition in a neutral system. The terms of the meeting were that both parties would come with their shields and weapons down and uncharged. Logan entered the system following these terms. His strike cruiser and its 4 escorts had their shields down, as well as their weapons. The Inquisition's containment fleet did not. As soon as the Space Wolf ships exited the warp, the Inquisition opened fire. The 4 escorts were destroyed almost immediately, while the strike cruiser had only a minute before she was also heavily damaged. After this ambush, Cisneros extended an offer to meet with Logan to discuss his surrender and an end to this conflict. Logan and his 3 Wolf Guard traveled to Cisneros' ship, the Fire of Dawn, where all the Inquisitors, the retinues, and the Grey Knights attached to this mess were waiting for them. Cisneros claimed that the reason why he had betrayed the Space Wolves was because they had violated the laws of the Imperium by snubbing the Inquisition's authority to protect the same Imperium from all enemies. As a result, he felt he had no choice but to bring this conflict between them to a swift end for the good of all. If the Wolves surrendered then and there, all their crimes would be forgiven and they would be welcomed back into the Imperium. Otherwise, Cisneros promised the chapter would suffer even worse than it already had. Logan did not care about Cisneros' explanation. He simply demanded who had given the order to open fire on his ships when they had come to talk as per the agreement. Lord Joros finally admitted that he had been the one to give the order, even if he had done it with regret in his heart. Logan did not let him feel that regret for long. Moving faster than any present thought possible, the Great Wolf rushed forward and beheaded the Grey Knight Grandmaster with a single swing of his axe. He then turned his attention to Cisneros, who had stopped anyone from shooting him. He told the Lord Inquisitor exactly what he thought of him, and that the Grey Knights should be ashamed for their part in the whole affair. When those same Grey Knights tried to stop the 4 wolves from leaving, they shot 4 Justicars, shattering the psychic barrier keeping them on Cisneros' ship. The Inquisitor did let them leave after that. Perhaps he should not have, because right after the failed parley, the wolves unleashed their anger on the Inquisition and the Grey Knights. No longer held back by their Jarl, the wolves actively hunted any Inquisition vessel they detected, and openly assaulted Grey Knight ships, including ambushing the flagship of the Grey Knights as a whole, destroying it and killing everyone aboard. In desperation, Cisneros called for help, getting the entire chapter fleet of the Red Hunters to come to his aid. This was done to show that the wolves did not represent the Astartes as a whole. He was right. You cannot use the Space Wolves to represent all Astartes. They are far above so many chapters, especially those sired from the Ultramarines and their arrogant Gene Father. It was also to get Space Marine support he could rely on, as the Grey Knights were beginning to become unreliable, many purposely slowing their reactions to news of Armageddon survivors in nearby systems, or somehow allowing Space Wolf vessels to slip by unharmed. He also managed to get control of an entire Imperial Navy battle fleet to aid him. But this massive force could still not contain the wolves, or their stubborn refusal to let the survivors of Armageddon die for such a pointless effort at this period. Eventually, after 8 months of fighting and chasing, Cisneros admitted that his plans had failed. The Space Wolves had outplayed him and ensured that too many survivors had escaped the Inquisition's net. Now he saw only one way to end this conflict. All his forces were to move to the Fenris system and put the very home of the Space Wolves under siege. This, to me, shows how desperate Cisneros was. He thought he would hold the very homeworld of the Wolves hostage and make Logan surrender to his demands. Of course, by this point, Armageddon was not the main concern for him. Now it was a matter of bringing the Wolves to heel and under the authority of the Imperium. Again, I have to admit that Cisneros was either very, very brave or completely stupid. Anyone knows you do not bring a wolf to heel like some mangy dog. And if you try, all you will get for your efforts is a wolf's jaws clamped firmly around your neck. When Kisnaros and his lackeys arrived in the system, they found Fenris virtually undefended in space. The fleet of the Space Wolves were far from their home, fighting the proper enemies of the Imperium across countless systems. Only a few young wolves were left to guard the Fang, the great fortress monastery of their chapter, alongside the army of chapter serfs, known in the Fenrisian dialect as thralls. Kisnaros demanded to speak to any wolf of rank present in the Fang. Aside from himself, he chose Hyperion, who had come to be known as Blade Breaker by the wolves for his action against Angron, and Inquisitor Jarl's daughter to come speak with whoever it was they would meet on Fenris. While he knew both of these individuals had been plotting to assassinate him, Kisnaros wanted the best to speak with the wolves. Jarl's daughter was Fenrisian born, so understood her own people, and Hyperion had the wolves' respect, not something to be ignored. But when they arrived on Fenris, I doubt they had any idea who they were going to meet. As the wolves' highest-ranked officer present, the young guards of the Fang had awoken Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the right hand of the Wolf King himself. The representatives immediately offered their sincere and profound respect towards the ancient warrior, and then Kisnaros screwed it up. He asked that the Space Wolves obey the chain of command and authority in the Imperium, which meant placing them under the command of organizations like the Inquisition or the Administratum. He also demanded the wolves undertake a penchant crusade to clean their record of the stain of attacking true servants of the Golden Throne, or more accurately, the Inquisition. In exchange for this merciful offer, the Inquisition and the wider Imperium would take no further action against the chapter. Bjorn responded by saying how this small, pitiful man was asking one of the oldest and most respected chapters in the Imperium to submit themselves to faceless bureaucrats and angry fools who prefer to rule by speed rather than honor. And he pointed out that Kisnaros was asking this while his fleet's guns were pointed directly at the Fang, which was also pointing right back. For such an ancient warrior, I was truly surprised to learn that Bjorn did not simply reach with his mighty claw and crush the Inquisitor in it right there. Unlike Kisnaros, the wolves intended to honor their meetings wherever they happened. However, before anything else could happen, Kisnaros received a message from his fleet in orbit. Without warning, the entire Space Wolf chapter fleet appeared above the Inquisition vessels. The three left Bjorn on Fenris and made it back to Kisnaros' new flagship, the Coral's Hope. There he was contacted by Logan, who snarled into the Vox and told him that the wolves had come. No other communication occurred before both fleets opened fire on each other. Kisnaros took command, and any panic he might have had vanished the minute he stepped into the ship's strategium. Leaving half of his fleet to begin bombarding the Fang, he commanded the other half to fight back against the wolves, who were attacking the Inquisition without any regard for their safety. Ships rammed into each other, while boarding torpedoes were fired at any vessel in range. At the same time, the defenses of the Fang, the greatest fortress outside of the Imperial Palace, opened up against the invading ships. In midst of this fight, Logan's own flagship came up beside Coral's Hope. There, the guns of the wolves brought the warship's void shields down. Immediately, the entire King's Guard and the Great Wolf teleported aboard the bridge, and Logan charged at Kisnaros. In spite of Hyperion, another Grey Knight, Inquisitor Jarl's daughter trying, Logan reached the Lord Inquisitor before anyone had a chance to stop him. With a single move, he cut off Kisnaros' head. The slaughter would have continued if Bjorn did not teleport on board, and I imagine he shouted, "Stop this madness!" The wolves stopped what they were doing the moment they heard Bjorn's voice, who demanded that Logan find a compromise with the Inquisition. At the same time, he told Jarl's daughter and Hyperion that from this moment on, no Inquisition ships will ever approach the Fenris system, and that Hyperion explained the mission of the Grey Knights and their importance to the Imperium to all the Space Wolves, instead of simply mind-wiping them as they usually did. Each side agreed to this in order to prevent further bloodshed and any more misunderstandings. Both sides agreed more out of necessity rather than a moral acceptance of Bjorn's demands. The campaign had taken a severe toll on both soldiers and material. And, of course, the casualties in these months were on top of those suffered during the fight for Armageddon itself. The real cost was the breakdown of trust between the Space Wolves and Imperial authorities that, to this day, has yet to heal. It also revealed the cracks in the ranks of the Grey Knights about the beliefs that whatever action they take is in the right, as well as the factionalism within the Inquisition itself. As the Inquisitors left, some of them already began planning how to make the Wolves pay for this defiance. At the same time, the Great Wolf and his Jarls knew the Inquisition would not leave them in peace. So in secret, they began to prepare for the next inevitable round with the Imperium's secret force. To this day, the Wolves are waiting for that fight. After all, the Inquisition does not forget, nor do they forgive. I have a constant reminder of that. And that is the tale of the First War for Armageddon. A brutal conflict and an even worse aftermath. But rather fitting, don't you think, for such a world? A planet that has been put through such a conflict, and while the people below us are not the descendants of those who fought in that war, they still fight worthy of those indirect ancestors. When you come back, I will tell you more about this world. Perhaps I should have begun with the story of the regiments that have become famous across the Imperium for their unique place in the Imperial Guard. But that is for another day. When I have the strength to tell you, I will send for you. Until then, best let me rest. This tale has drained me, and I need to recover. Don't worry, I will be happy to see you once more.